So let's start adding in some clarity into this sketch and bring in some layers of depth. So the first thing I'm going to do is add in this third value into the scene. That is automatically going to start creating spatial depth. Value by its very nature changes when there's a change in directional plane. That's going to apply both to objects in the environment as well as the environment itself, although it's slightly different for both. So on an object like a box, if light hits it, each side of that box is going to receive a different amount of light, which is subsequently going to cause a different value to form. That's how we start to see volume. The same rings true for landscapes like this. The only difference is the directional planes in this instance are receding back into the picture frame. So imagine this as a series of glass window panes that we're painting on top of. Generally, things that are closer towards the viewer are darker and have more contrast, and as things recede away from the viewer, things become more light and atmospheric, and the contrast becomes a lot lessened. There are exceptions to this, of course, but it's a general good rule to start with. Now, we can see the two value additions have already started to create the illusion of depth, giving us three layers, a foreground, midground, and background. We could even consider the sky as a fourth layer too. So this would be a good place to stop right here and move on to another concept, but let's just work on incorporating a little bit of depth into this scene, and we'll start with adding a little bit of gradation into the sky. The sky gets lighter as it approaches the horizon, so our eye is naturally going to follow the path here where the lighter area is. The sky has different plane changes, so it's going to follow the same logic that we talked about. A change in directional plane is going to be equal to a change in value. In this instance, it's also helping to lead the eye towards the castle. So this is not only helping to create a sense of atmosphere, it's acting as one of our visual landmarks. We talked about developing a narrative, deciding on which layers are the focal point. These tools for depth are there to help reinforce those ideas and lead the audience to the exact point we want them to look at. So looking at this castle now, and I'm thinking it probably needs to come down a little bit in its value. That will also make it stand out from the sky a little bit more. So really, we are working with four values here. We've already used gradation to help establish more depth, but notice how we've automatically also established overlapping with just our value changes. We've brought that mountainous formation forward with its darker value, which is now overlapping the mountains in the midground, which is subsequently overlapping the castle in the background. So we've established a hierarchy of objects. What we want to try to avoid doing is having two objects at different distances looking as if they are touching each other right on the edge. That's going to create a tangent, which is going to cause visual tension. That can be used as a tool, but we want to avoid doing it accidentally. If we have different planes, we want to avoid them looking as if they are blending together, because tangents will often flatten an image out. So I'm going to turn my attention to using line now to push the audience's eye through to the background. We've got the path and the canyon, the little river snaking its way along. We've even got the cast shadow and the rock formation too. So lines converging towards what would probably be the door to the castle. But we've also got implied lines here as well. Take note of how the edges of the rocky hills in the midground are helping with that direction. They are also converging to the center of the castle. So line is more than just the strokes we put down or the literal lines that something like a road or river makes. It's something that can be heavily implied to create direction, even closure. Closure is about creating a completed shape, having our eyes move around the picture in a certain way and ending up back where we begin. So you might notice here that the river, even though it is in the midground, that it's closer in value to the foreground rock formation. What we have to remember is that everything we paint is going to have its own starting value. So just because we might have a bunch of different objects in the midground doesn't mean they're all going to start at the exact same value. So in this instance, the water is darker, so its value levels in the midground are going to be different from the canyon and the canyon walls and surrounding rock. So just adding a little bit of detail into the rock here just to help convey the story. Again, this is probably the upper limits of where you want to take your thumbnail compositions. We have the advantage, of course, if we're working digitally, where we've got an array of texture brushes and lighting settings within our software that we can use to save a lot of time and help develop thumbnails quicker. So if you're working in Procreate or Affinity Photo or Photoshop, you can use the curve tools or the levels tools in those applications to quickly change the range of contrast and try out different overlays and textures. Of course, it's different if we're working practically. I'm using Realistic Paint Studio, which is a lot closer to working with real tools. So if we're working practically, we don't have the luxury that is available to our digital counterparts. But whichever way we work, we don't want to spend much more than 5 minutes on any one thumbnail study. If there's a specific story requirement, you might very well need to spend an additional minute or so just to get that idea across. So for instance, if a client was to say to you, well, we need this landscape to look a little more scary and intimidating and a bit more of a challenge to our hero character, maybe have a couple of dragons flying in the background, then of course you'd come in over the top with a few extra details right at the end. So just putting in a couple of twisted trees here and maybe a couple of additional sharper looking areas of rock, that little bit of extra texture to try to capture the idea of the world. But ignore the tendency to detail. Detailing really is kind of the fun stuff with illustration, but we also have to restrain ourselves a little bit here and save a little bit of that energy for when we start doing the final composition. Once we've got our thumbnail design sorted, then we can start planning ahead for the real artwork. So we'll start to finish up here. Hopefully these tools that we've gone over help you in your compositional sketches. So just to reiterate everything, always think about your graphical footprint first, your basic light and dark shapes. Think about whether the image is form or shape dominant. Establish your values and range of contrast and put in just enough details and depth just to get the ideas across. With this out of the way, let's move on to the assignment.